Recording in progress. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another live episode of the Gestalt Get-Together. This is my first solo episode in a long time. I'm really excited, even though I love playing off of another guest. I love being able to do a deep dive in the research and be able to yap without without stopping. So thanks for joining. I'm going to be talking about the intersection of basically my three favorite things, which are Gestalt Language Processing, Hyperlexic. So this might be my favorite episode ever. But first, I do want to make sure those of you who are joining live with Speech Therapy PD, and shout out, thank you so much for sponsoring this podcast to Speech Therapy PD. Make sure you get credit after this episode by taking the quiz after we finish up, and you have until the end of the day to do that. Now, if you are watching live somewhere else, maybe on YouTube, and you're like, wait a minute, I want to get credit for that too, head on over to Speech Therapy PD to sign up. And if you haven't done a course with them yet, use my code Gestalt33 so you can get this for free and get credit. We're coming up at the end of the year. You need your hours, right? And if you're a parent, you're like, what does any of that mean? Don't worry about it. Let's get to the good stuff. Again, today we're going to be talking about hyperlexia, music, and Gestalt language processing. This is a live episode, and so for those of you who are here, don't be shy about putting things in the chat. I'll do my best to keep up with them, and I will be reading your questions and comments out loud for those of you who are listening later on, maybe on Spotify or Apple Music. So hyperlexia, GLP, and music. First, let's zoom back and do an overview about what hyperlexia is. For those of you who are here live, I'd love for you to throw in the chat something that you might know about hyperlexia, maybe a kid on your caseload who's hyperlexic, and share what you already know about hyperlexia as I start to map this out. So hyperlexia refers to a profile of a child, and that child is demonstrating, this is a very popular word with hyperlexia, precocious decoding, precocious word reading ability that doesn't match up with what we'd expect for their age. And more often than not, does not match up with their comprehension skills. There are some researchers and thinkers out there who don't have as clear of a distinction between comprehension and decoding. Most of them say that comprehension is going to be well below decoding ability. As well as we see overlaps in the literature with challenges using language socially. There are definitely quite a lot of overlaps with the autistic population, and really like deep special interests. So much passion for, orthography, for alphabet, for numbers, for the system of codes. And that's going to be an area I do talk about a lot today, is this idea of codes, because I want you as therapists and parents to start to notice the codes all around you that you might take for granted, that you're so used to these systems of, these symbolic systems. And if we can bring our attention to them in a more intentional way, it might be easier to understand why the kid in front of you loves them so much and is so drawn to them. There's so much logic in them. Logic feels really safe in a world that might feel like sensory overwhelm, in a world of social cues that don't make sense, in a world that has fluctuating expectations, and also a body that might have fluctuating experiences of itself. My goodness, logic and patterns feel very, very safe. So there is a paper that I pulled from a lot. It's a really powerful paper. It's from 2017. It's called Hyperlexia, Systematic Review, Neurocognitive Modeling, and Outcome. Of course, I'm going to be putting that in the chat for you guys. And this paper gives a lot of great information. It is a systematic review, right? So it's pulling from a lot of different places. And they outlined, those advanced decoding skills related to age or comprehension. They talk about those strong fascinations with written symbols. This even extends to things like logos. I've had a couple of clients who love logos. They will walk up and down the aisles of the parking lot. They will name like all the car brands, So I had a stage 2 client whose first like slot and frame was, it's a Honda, it's a Corvette, it's a Mitsubishi. It was so sweet. I've also had hyperlexic GLPs, of course, who they also experience hypernumeracy, so numbers, and that system of meaning is really compelling to them. There are patterns of enjoying other alphabets, like Korean is a big one that I see and the clients I've worked with, but the winner far and away, and I hear this from so many speech therapists, is Russian. Russian is just, that's where it's at. I can look over at a number of my clients' iPads over the years, and they've got Cocomelon playing in Russian. Um, and I got some ideas around that, especially related to prosody, the underlying musicality of the language. I also wonder if the shapes of those letters are really compelling for them. I haven't really looked at the like visually and saw if there's anything that was particularly interesting about the shape overlaps. But the musicality of Russian is very clearly there. There's also interest in Mandarin and other tonal languages, because tonal languages, and there's actually a researcher I'll talk about in a moment who studied tonal language and its relationship to music. Tonal languages have such distinct pitch changes. The pitch of your voice makes it a completely different word in some cases. And so I wonder if, those languages that have the more intense musicality and prosodic variations and that sing-song nature, a GLP is really drawn to. And if they're a hyperlexic GLP, forget it. You've got this different alphabet with interesting shapes, combinations of lines and curves. And then the people who speak it, their voices are up and down all over the place. It must be a really rich sensory experience for them. So I talked about alphabets, also diacritics. So if you're a speech therapist and you think about IPA, you think about diacritics. I was never very good at diacritics, like marking like the breath, the type of breath, or like just all the little details of transcribing what you hear. I was good at the regular transcription, but diacritics were difficult. But you know who got me back into them? Was an older hyperlexic GLP, because they were drawn to all of the little symbols that could go above letters, next to letters, below letters, all of these little, I might call them mitigations or modulations on that original code. And then the last one I wanted to mention, because as I've worked with kids over the years, as they get older, their hyperlexia is able to take them in really cool new directions. And I have a 9-year-old client who, for the first maybe month or two, would exclusively communicate with me using their own self-generated code, and I had a cipher. And if you don't know what that is, think about if there's some sort of code to communicate secretly, you then have a cipher where like A equals a star, B equals an ampersand, and so on and so forth. And so I would have to decode their code using this cipher. And it was this really advanced usage of their love of letters to communicate with a brand new person. If you're listening live, feel free if you want to throw anything into the chat about hyperlexic kids you've worked with, or if what I'm saying reminds you of a kid in your life. All right, so I also wanted to note that there are a couple of areas of variation in the research and debate. I think we should always be debating and trying to better operationalize what we're talking about. Some of the areas of variation between different researchers and different people who are thinking about and talking about hyperlexia are the following. People are wondering exactly how much better does a child have to be at decoding than comprehending to qualify as hyperlexic. That insinuates a cutoff point. That gets us down a whole different path of discussion. But it's an interesting thing to think about is, what does that gap have to be to qualify as hyperlexia? Do we need a standard score? Do we need percentile gaps? Things like that. I'm not the person to ask about that, but it's a question to think about. We also want to think about people's varying ideas around age of onset. How early is early for that level of decoding skill? Is it before age 3, 4, 5? You hear from parents and therapists, they've had hyperlexic GLPs where it's before 2 years old. You've got an 18-month-old who is decoding and reading. So where does hyperlexia kind of start and end developmentally? Again, I am not the person to ask that, but get you thinking. Another point of variation and debate, its relationship to autism. If you're listening to this episode, you probably work with a lot of autistic kids. You definitely work with a lot of GLPs, or you're learning about it. But when it comes to hyperlexia, is it one-to-one with autism? And when it comes to community sampling and clinical experiences, no, it's not. Just like not all Gestalt processors are autistic. I've had Gestalt processors who, had a range of clinical profiles, but most Gestalt processors I've worked with, and probably you too, happen to be autistic. Um, and I would say that for hyperlexic, well, most of the hyperlexic kids that I've worked with have been autistic as well. But, that point of variation is what is the degree to which we consider hyperlexia to overlap with autism versus like a separate phenomenon. And let's see. Nope, those are the main three that are kind of the areas of contention and debate. I wanted to go back in time and talk about the hysteria of hyperlexia. The hysteria, I cannot take that A off when I'm talking about hyperlexia, the history. I think about how much I wish I knew more about the history of my field and figuring out where did these ideas come from and how did they change. I think occupational therapists, they get decent historical training on their field. So I've been trying to make more of an effort for that to share with you guys. So hyperlexia, the first place we can really see it come up, and this is where the term was coined, at least that we know of, was actually in 1967 to 68. This was by Norman E. Silderberg and Margaret C. Silderberg, so dream team right there. So they coined the term hyperlexia all the way back then, and they talked to, that word precocious, that precocious reading ability. It's these kids who start reading single words really early before they're formally instructed and have stronger decoding skills relative to their comprehension skills. Then in the early 1980s, we see some work about hyperlexia then related to autism very explicitly. And they are talking about the decoding ability is a lot higher than would be predicted based on IQ measures. And then the reading comprehension, they described it as severely delayed. And it's interesting because we think about kind of older language around autism, like infantile autism. There's also writing there about, they talked about it as a kind of compulsive decoding. It's like compulsion to decode, which we might talk about today as like very passionate decoding, or like they're extremely interested and motivated by decoding rather than a compulsion to. So that's another reason why I like looking back at like the early research is how are people talking about this and how are we talking about it now? It's always really interesting. In the mid 1980s, there was a study, 1986 to be precise, by Healy and Aram. It was called Hyperlexia and Dyslexia, and they did a family study. And they were looking at family histories of hyperlexic kids. They found that there are familial tendencies toward language challenges and reading challenges, especially among male relatives. Pardon me. And they were talking about like overlaps and differentiation from dyslexia with hyperlexia. And so that's a paper, if you're interested in looking into that. Again, it's Hyperlexia and Dyslexia, a family study. When we move into the 1990s, we are seeing people looking more and more into hyperlexia. We're getting like a couple more studies as we move into the 90s. There still aren't a ton. Hopefully, we're going to see more and more as people learn about hyperlexia, as they get interested in it, but also most importantly, as we start to recognize it in the kids who are right in front of us and get curious. Because if we're not naming something, if we're not seeing a pattern in it, we're probably not going to do anything about it. And people aren't going to know that they want to study something that they don't have a framework for. So in the 90s, we're seeing a study on an adolescent and using a comprehension-based therapy strategy to help them, to not work on decoding with them for reading, but to really focus on the comprehension. And it was a helpful intervention. 2003, there was a paper about is hyperlexia, a disability versus a superability. This was by Grigorenko et al. 2003. 2010, they looked at hyperlexia and dyslexia in bilingual children, which is a really interesting angle. That was by Joshi Padakanaya and Nishan MS in 2010. And any of these, I can get you guys the citation if you're interested. 2017, that's when we saw that systematic review that I mentioned, which is just a really powerful paper that brings all of this together. And then 2022, we did see some case reports come out from Mamarella et al. Talking about autistic children with hyperlexia. One of them had really high comprehension, and one of them did have lower comprehension. So even though there aren't a lot of studies, we have a range of studies that are looking at different angles at it. So it's interesting to see. And if you're a speech therapist out there who is interested in hyperlexia, maybe you could go research it because we need more, please. But I want to highlight something because there are probably a lot of speech therapists out there who weren't able to publish anything, who were so busy being a clinician or working in schools that they couldn't write anything up, who were doing great things for hyperlexic kids. They just weren't able to put out into the world. But I did find a publication from all the way back in 2003. It was a group of speech therapists and occupational therapists from the Center for Speech and Language Disorders. And all the way back in 2003, they published kind of a guidebook and a workbook for how to approach hyperlexic kids. It's extremely parent-friendly. I'm going to be putting the link in that the link for that in the chat right now. I recommend looking at it. A lot of the information there is still really relevant and powerful today. They did an update in 2013 from that, so 10 years later. So definitely take a look at that. It might actually be something great to adapt and share with families you work with. And if you're a parent listening to this later on, I recommend taking a look at it. If you are unable to click on the link because you're listening later, it is chatwithus.org, and that will hopefully get you where you need to go. However, if that doesn't get you where you need to go, come find me on Instagram and I will get you that link. There were two quotes in this publication that I had to read. I feel like they set the stage for what we're about to talk about next. Number one is by Susan Martins Miller, and it says, quote, "Write, write, write, because the child with hyperlexia will read, read, read." I'm going to frame that. The other one, this was from the Canadian Hyperlexia Association. "When in doubt, write it out. If it isn't written, it may not exist." And we know that to be true when it comes to contract law, right? Put it in writing. We know that to be true in other places. If it isn't in writing, it didn't happen. Let's bring that into our sessions with hyperlexic GLPs. So let's talk about hyperlexia and Gestalt processors. There's a unique combination there, and you may work with Gestalt processors that don't really fit that hyperlexic profile. I find more often than not, I'm seeing hyperlexic traits in the GLPs that I work with. So where are the intersections? One aspect we can think about is the route to learning. With hyperlexia, there's that strong decoding, there's visual recognition of words. And with Gestalt processing, we've got this language acquisition from these chunks or these scripts or delayed echolalia. The interaction there for learning route is that the hyperlexic child may be not instead of, because they're likely picking up on, spoken gestalts too, but they may be reading the chunks and treating them like scripts similar to spoken chunks. And that could be at the level of a line of text, like chicka chicka boom boom, will there be enough room? That might be the chunk that's acquired as the visual script or the written script. It might be a street sign. It might be a logo. It could be an entire book, or as one of my favorite kids in the world has, their hyperlexia, the entire written script of How to Train Your Dragon. That is one gestalt to them, the entire screenplay or the written script of it. So it doesn't just have to be a couple of words in front of you. The unit can be extremely long. I think about kind of like the famous like GLPs of the 90s, where it was the entire script to Aladdin. It was the entire script to Bug's Life. The same can be for hyperlexic GLPs with the written word. So when it comes to echolalia, for hyperlexic GLPs, there'd be an echoing of the lines that they find in written text, and could also be a rewriting of the lines. A video just went around of a kid who was probably a hyperlexic GLP. You might have seen it, who was using chalk on their driveway to write out different fonts like Comic Sans, Cambria, Times New Roman. You could guess or you could infer that each of those font names was its own gestalt. And then he was replicating that. He, was replicating the written gestalt of that font name. And of course, visually, it had to match up. You can't write Times New Roman in Comic Sans, at least not in stage 1. We might play with that later on in the stages, though. Comprehension. Where might hyperlexia and Gestalt processing have that interaction, or that interaction, I think is the best word for that. So with hyperlexia, they are going to have the weaker interpretation of what they're reading. And then with Gestalt processors, they're going to have that weaker comprehension of all of the parts of that script or of that delayed echolalia. They're going to comprehend the whole of it. They're going to get the emotional, the social whole, the contextual whole, but not each individual word yet. So you can see kind of that similarity there of hyperlexia and GLP is that decoding outpaces comprehension. And then with GLPs, production and length of utterance is going to outpace, not that every gestalt is really long, right? We've got a lot of single word gestalts, but the ability to produce what to us sounds like rich grammar is to them just one unit. And then this idea of therapeutic mismatch. And I think a lot of us can look back at some of our early work and realize, okay, I was providing a mismatched therapy style to who I now could call a hyperlexic GLP. So with hyperlexia, there might be more standard like interventions that are trying to, like, assuming that analytic processing style, or therapeutic mismatch of stop letting them do all those letters. No more letter play. Like, they're not, just enough with that. Whereas, like, a lot of us know, or you might be coming to find out, lean into those letters. So that could be a therapeutic mismatch of like cutting off their interest in the alphabet or trying to move them in other directions. And then with Gestalt processing, a therapeutic mismatch would be kind of like the rote teaching of single words, word plus word plus word, rather than Marge Blanc's NLA approach, which a lot of us are using and pulling from. So misaligned interventions, there's that interaction there that could hinder a child's progress, be very confusing to them because they really love something like that and the world makes sense through that system of code. It's probably distressing for someone to take that away from you or try to leverage it in also like a controlling way too. Okay, so speaking of codes, I'm about to go off about one of my favorite topics. I've wanted to do a whole episode on this, but I thought that tonight could be a good introduction to it. This is a term I really hope you take with you. I hope it gets you curious about reading about it. There's not a ton of writing about it, but the writing that exists about this concept is so rich. And the papers about this have, I'm always hyperbolic, but I'm not being hyperbolic, changed my life. Like, it truly changed my life. And that is called veridical mapping. Veridical mapping it's mostly related to autistic brains, is the autistic brain's really natural ability to create accurate and rule-based links between different symbolic systems. And what this does is we see this unique ability to perceive and understand and make connections between systems of code, allow for precocious decoding, musical ability, mathematical ability, and engagement in other structured domains. We also see this in autistic individuals who have an immense grasp on art, especially art that requires the interpretation of shadow, of color theory, of dimension and depth, which can all come back to mathematics, to rules and physics. So veridical mapping is this lens you can look at autistic processing, hyperlexia, musical abilities, and I would argue even Gestalt language processing to a certain degree, because it's a mode of learning that is all about structure, patterns, symbology, and overlapping different systems of meaning. So one of the first people to talk about this concept without naming it was Diana Deutsch. And this was, I believe, in 1981. I'd have to check. Without calling it vertical mapping, Diana Deutsch looked at, she was a cognitive neuroscience who studied music. So my dream, my goal. But later on, this idea of vertical mapping was furthered by Dr. Laurent Motron, who actually contributes to hyperlexia research. So clearly an overlap. So Deutsch's work, she studied absolute pitch, which is, and you might have a client like this, or it might be your kid, where they hear a note and then they can name it. Or they hear a note and then they go hit on the piano. Or you try and sing a song to them and they yell at you because you're not singing in the original key. So they might have absolute pitch, or what we call perfect pitch. Deutsch also talked about what they call the hierarchical encoding of sensory information, that when the brain encodes sensory information, there's different hierarchies for it. There's a structure that sensory information is trying to become encoded in to make sense of the world. And she also talked about perceptual mapping. How does the brain create maps of all of these tiny sensations that the body comes into contact with, all of the visual information, all of the haptic information, auditory information, pitch, pressure, smell even. How are all of those sensations mapped in the brain and encoded so that then we can move to higher level meaning? So Deutsch focused on music and language and musical pitches. She was noticing how these things can kind of map to one another, even though they're considered different domains. There's this alignment that can happen between them because they can both be encoded in terms of hierarchy. So when it comes to music, like a simple example of a hierarchy is that there are notes, do, re, mi, fa, sol. Actually, let me pull that back. Forget that I said those words on top of there. Ha, 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 ha. Those are the pitches. Ha, pitch, ha, pitch. Then I put them together and into a melody. Ha. Then I can put that into a whole song. So you can see there's different levels to it. Note, melody, phrase, song. So I made the mistake, right? I put do, re, mi, fa, sol. I naturally layered language on top because I decided to take phoneme plus phoneme, which are small units. I combine them into a syllable, which is that next part of the hierarchy. They happen to constitute a word, which is that next part of the hierarchy. And then I put them into kind of like a sentence, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol. You can fight me on that. But what I was doing is I was taking the small units of music, I was building them up, and then I was mapping on top small units of language that then built up. So we had this overlap of two different hierarchies of meaning. One was more perceptual, and then one was more semantic. So she found that instead of the brain kind of taking in the series of just like raw sounds, the brain was actually identifying those sounds as nested within something bigger, as being kind of subdivisions of something greater. And we could see this with language as well, at least further down the line for Gestalt language processors, is that they take in all the raw material, but then over time they realize, oh my goodness, there are words that are nested within this. There are subdivisions within this that I can pull out and make sense of. And so music and language can map onto one another. And that's where a kid with perfect pitch or absolute pitch, they know that do has a specific name and a specific location on that piano. And when they hear that note, they go play it. Whereas I only have relative pitch. So if I hear do, I can go over to a piano and probably get pretty close, but I do not have a perfect mapping in my brain of that. Most people don't. So then moving on to the work of Dr. Laurent Motron and colleagues, they really looked at the connection between veridical mapping and autistic cognition. And they were the ones who really kind of like coined veridical mapping. And they were talking about how this is a phenomena of processing where the brain spontaneously creates these one-to-one representational maps between different types of structured information, numbers and letters, maybe even, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting excited. I love these topics. So numbers and letters, musical pitches and numbers, musical pitches and letters. I'm thinking about artistic correlates as well to this. And I am currently talking to my friend who's an artist and speech therapist. We are planning an episode for next year about how to use art with Gestalt language processors. So I'm definitely going to talk to her about this and get her thoughts. So we talked about that structured information, these ideas of codes, and how those can be veridically mapped to one another. I kind of think about like, imagine different layers of code. So like if like alphabets here, numbers are here, musical pitches are here, like how can these be layered on top of one another? And if you're listening without watching this, you're not seeing my hands, but I'm kind of stacking them like layers of a sandwich. Like how do these things, how can they map onto one to another one to one? So language, it's got hierarchy of letters, phonemes, syllables, words, phrases. Those are different parts, like the smaller units. But then we go to sentence, we go to paragraph, we go to corpus. Like there's different levels of that hierarchy. Same for music. We've got different note names. We've got different types of rhythm, 8th note, 16th note. And then they get bigger, bigger, bigger and intersect. Math, we've got numbers, equations, up to logarithms, algorithms. There's hierarchies here of all this information. And then I don't know about you, but I've had plenty of clients who love calendars. They love train timetables. They love maps. They love flags. They love outer space. Outer space is so contingent upon numbers and distances. And so there's all these different coding systems. And then obviously just like coding, right? I think about so many of my clients as they get older, it's like, wait a minute, maybe learning how to code is a really like fun direction for you. So vertical mapping is considered, at least in the literature and my own experience, and you might come to feel that way too, is a real strength. It's a real cognitive strength for autistic individuals because their mind is able to find these natural alignment between subunits of two systems. They find, it seems pretty naturally, shared patterns. They find overlapping features, and then they create meaningful connections between them. The reason I got off track a little earlier is because I was starting to go the direction of synesthesia. And I'm curious if anyone here has heard about synesthesia. It's when there are those one-to-one mappings between things that might not be considered systems or codes. So I have synesthesia myself. And what that probably means is that early in development, my brain created one-to-one connections between kind of arbitrary things. To my brain, they're not arbitrary. Like the letter C is pink. The letter C is a girl. The letter C is number 3. The letter C is ice cream. That's just how it is in my brain. I cannot separate threeness from pinkness. And so those are like those kind of one-to-one correspondences that are not necessarily derived from some external structure. That's just something that my brain probably prune away or like overdeveloped for some reason. Synesthesia is fascinating. If you haven't read about it, I really recommend looking into it. They find that it kind of follows a matrilineal path genetically. And the Venn diagram of synesthesia autism is one that's, I really am, because I've had a couple clients where when I start to figure out their synesthesia patterns and I lean into them, they're like, I start using like the right gender to talk about numbers, like, oh, 2, here he comes. 3, there she goes. Things seem to pick up a little bit quicker. It's really interesting. So back to vertical mapping. Synesthesia, I would not necessarily consider that vertical mapping because, 2 being blue, you might feel like 2 is yellow, and you're wrong. And that makes my stomach flip because 2 is blue and always will be. So veridical mapping, we can see this in kind of that precocious decoding ability in hyperlexia because they're mapping out written letters to spoken phonemes, just map. Got it. Because they see them in parallel, they hear them in parallel, and they don't need explicit teaching because those two things, those two codes have been mapped to one another. They may also very easily map musical notes to finger positions on a piano. And then being able to map the visual symbols of like notes or finger position to sheet music, which we're going to talk about quite soon. And so they're building this overlapping understanding between two systems of meaning. I'm going to place in the chat one of my favorite citations, which is about this whole idea of enhanced perceptual functioning in autism, which is an interesting framework. If you haven't heard about that before, enhanced perceptual functioning, I find it to be helpful to explain a lot of what I see in Gestalt language processors. It helps answer some of the questions, or at least attempt to answer some of the questions about like, why does the GLP like this? Why does the GLP thrive with this? Why does that thing confuse a GLP? So I'm going to send this citation here. Oh, and it looks like what I've been sending has only been going to hosts and panelists. I am so sorry, everyone. Let me backtrack and get you the one about hyperlexia too. Great, sent and ready. So I want to talk about why music for autistic kids in general. So kind of a zoom out. You might, your gut might say, well, of course music. Music is fun. Of course music. But I always want to get a little bit deeper because I think that sometimes, unfortunately, music can kind of be devalued and written off because it's like, everybody likes music. Like, of course I'll do music. It's seen, I'm having trouble thinking of the right word. Not written off, but it's like, yeah, of course. And then we don't think deeper about it. I think that's what it is. And what I want to know, what I'm really trying to look into and study is what are the mechanics of music that are going to make a difference for a Gestalt language processor and why. It's not just singing Wheels on the Bus. It's when, it's how you modulate your voice. There's so much about the how and the when of music that can take it to the next level. So when it comes to pulling from music theory with autistic kids, there's so many patterns in music. Think about Western music. A lot of it is based on the number 4. And if that's our base number, then it's easy to recognize patterns when things happen in eighths, they happen in sixteenths. When even 3/4 time, like a waltz, da 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 da, there's still that basis in 4. So music theory is based upon mathematics, even the frequencies of the pitches that we hear. If I play a middle C on piano, that sound wave is going that's 440 hertz. It's just math. You cannot take math out of music. You cannot take math out of sound. And so if there's mathematics underneath that, we can use that regularity. We can use that sense of patterning to help the kids in front of us. Whereas my spoken language, the pitch information is going to be so variable. And if I'm coming in them with a voice that's 250 hertz up to 251, down to 100, that's a lot of confusing auditory information. But if I'm singing something, it is more precise because it is better mapped to cleaner acoustic information that can be better represented on a piano or a musical instrument. Music also just naturally lights up the reward centers of the brain. It naturally lights up even the motor networks, because if we're thinking rhythm, I want you to think about time and motor. Rhythm is all about how we parse up the passage of time with predictable events. And for an autistic brain, the processing of time can be quite different. Rhythm can help to be kind of a way, like a timekeeper, an external timekeeper to make the world make more sense. And rhythm isn't just an auditory marker of the passage of time that makes the world more pattern. It's also a visual marker of the passage of time. Think about when you're turning in your car and you put on your blinker. Da, 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 da. You can hear it. The person behind you sees the rhythm. So rhythm can also be visual, but can also be haptic. And that can be the feeling of rhythm. So you can feel like a pulsing through your feet of music. You can feel your phone vibrating to a certain rhythm. So rhythm can happen in a lot of different ways. A lot of time they often overlap. But because the passage of time is different for autistic individuals and for Gestalt processors and potentially for hyperlexic individuals, their internal rhythm might be a little bit different. Their ability to perceive your external rhythm might be more difficult. And so we're not really meeting in the middle well. Music kind of becomes that middle ground where we can meet because the rhythm of music is helping them sync up. The rhythm of the music is helping you sync up to them syncing up. It's this middle ground that can make more sense because of the way that math is kind of like taking the lead there. The mathematics of it say, hey, here's structure. Both of you get in here so you can connect with each other better. So music, we think reward, we think lighting up language. It's lighting up all the language networks we need anyway. So let's use it. So then I think about music theory and I'm thinking about, okay, what are the parallels between basic elements of music theory and GLP? So there's a music theory concept of the phrase, the musical phrase. I apologize. The language parallel is a gestalt. The musical phrase and then the gestalt, those are an overlap there. A phrase is kind of that musical idea. You might see it come up again and again, as it might look to be like a motif as well, a musical motif or a musical theme. That could be the repetition of a gestalt, one that comes up again and again. When we think about rhythmic subdivision in music, it's this ability to think about a rhythm and then break it down and parse it to better understand it. And then once you break it down, you can say, ooh, let me use that element in my next song. Ooh, let me take that rhythm and let me put it over here. What if I switch them? And maybe that reminds you of stage 2 or stage 4, where we take the rhythm of a whole song or a whole phrase or an entire movie script and figure out how to parse it down and then play with it in new ways. So rhythmic subdivision is kind of a perfect mirror of the language breaking down as we see kids follow Blank's framework, Marge Blank's framework. Blanc from, I keep mirroring my own vowels word to word. Marge Blank's framework of natural language acquisition from 2012. Time signatures, bar lines. Time signature is, and also I think tempo as well relates into that, is about pacing and prosody in language. And so if I'm talking really, really fast like this, and it's going to be that would be like fast tempo in music. But if I'm speaking to you like this, you might say that this is a slower tempo, like a slower tempo in music. And the pacing of your voice when you're interacting with a Gestalt language processor is going to make an impact. So much of when I'm coaching SLPs and parents is about let's shift how you're saying it. You're modeling great potential gestalts. I love the language in there. Let's shift the how, which is about things like tempo. It's about the rhythm behind it. It's about the melody of your voice. So there's a couple of overlaps there. We're thinking melody, we're thinking pitch, we're thinking phrases, motifs. But then what I want to bring it over to, because there's all these overlaps, right? And we're thinking, okay, great music, okay, great gestalts, language, there's veridical mapping between musical elements and linguistic elements, blah, 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 Corinne, okay, there's math, sure. Because then you're thinking, okay, but what do I do tomorrow? What do I do tomorrow with these kids on my caseload? Thank you for all the theory. I'm stressed and I don't know what to do with these kids. Let's talk about it. So the first area I talk about, I try and start with the most concrete, which is musical instruments. So I'd love to hear from anyone who is listening live, if any of you use musical instruments in your work, or if any of you have thought about it. And if you have used instruments, tell me a little bit about how. While you're doing that, I'm going to start to tell you about some of my go-to ideas for instruments. So my favorites for hyperlexic GLPs are keyboards and pianos, string instruments with frets. I don't mess around with cellos, violins, and violas and basses quite yet, maybe in the future. And boom whackers. I see someone saying that they use toy instruments, which I think is a good start. I think sometimes the musical quality of those can be a little bit distressing to the kids I've worked with because they're not the highest quality. Also, selfishly, I think that they sound terrible, and so I don't like to use them. But that's also, me speaking from a place of privilege that I'm able to acquire good instruments, right? And so I say use what you have. But there might be a reason behind a GLP not really enjoying like a not real musical instrument. You know what I mean? Like a toy one, if the timbre of it isn't quite right. I've also found that toy instruments, especially toy xylophones, the pitches are not precise. So if I play a scale on a toy xylophone, I'm cringing because it's not the true notes. I see someone saying they use shaker eggs. Absolutely. That is so great. You can harness rhythm with that. I've worked with some kids where I'll tap along with the shaker egg as I model a potential gestalt. So that's a great one. So let's start with boom whackers. If you're not familiar with boom whackers, these are hilarious. I love these. I have them in my car all the time, all the time. So let me tell you about them. They are actually becoming more and more common in school settings, and it makes sense why. They're great learning tools. They are plastic tubes, and they're cut precisely at different lengths so that when it's tapped, it produces a specific musical note. So the really long ones produce super low notes. The short ones produce super high notes. And then if you tap two of them at the same time, you can make harmony because mathematically, the two notes that you're playing, they have a really nice, clean mathematical relationship. For example, like if I play the C4 tube, that's at 440 hertz, but then I play the C5 tube, that's 880 hertz. That's a really clean relationship, 440 to 880. We call that an octave. So you play those at the same time. A kid might be like, whoa, that sounds really good because the math behind it is fantastic. You can also tap these in order to create a melody, like do 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 do. If you tap the boom whackers, when it comes, let's bring it back to hyperlexia though, right? All of them are labeled. So these tubes are labeled with their corresponding note names, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, in order. They also say boomwhacker on them, and so pretty naturally that gets picked up as a single word gestalt because they're reading it. The classic collection of boomwhackers gives you an octave, but they also have a full spectrum set that goes like up a couple octaves. What's interesting about those is that because they give you sharps and flats, there's actually a little bit of reading ambiguity or code ambiguity there. So there actually isn't perfect vertical mapping. If you get the ones that have sharps and flats, some of the tubes are going to say things like B flat slash A sharp. Because depending on what you're creating musically, a note could be B flat or it could be A sharp. So I think that could be a fun thing to play with maybe hyperlexic GLPs who are in like stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, because it isn't going to be a perfect one-to-one vertical map for them necessarily. So they can read the letters on them. They've got this set of instruments that is in ABC order up to G. But also they're in rainbow order. And if you work with GLPs, rainbow order is kind of a big deal, right? So I love that there is rainbow order and there are letters, and that actually, we can consider that mapping because we've got the order of the rainbow mapped to the order of the letters. A red, D orange, E yellow, so on and so forth. So it's just like a GLP dream. I love these things. And I use them for a lot of different activities. So I use them as tunnels for cars. I send ping pong balls down them. They perfectly fit shaker eggs down the tube. Really anything can go down them. And what I'll do for hyperlexic GLPs is I'll anchor my modeling in the letter name. because that just it brings so much joy to be able to talk about and sing about letters. But then I'll put in other language that's going to get us further in the later stages. So for example, like um, the Honda is sliding down the E tube. And you might hear that I'm bringing my voice down as I'm singing. The Honda is sliding down, da da da, sliding down. So I'm kind of matching what my voice is doing to the meaning of it. So it's like perceptual semantic mapping there. Sliding down the E tube. So that child is going to hear, ooh, Honda. I love Honda. E tube. I love the letter E. Maybe I'll pay attention to what this lady is singing to me, and maybe I'll pick it up. Maybe I'll acquire it, and maybe I'll use it. Another example might be the C boom whacker is red. Very on the nose, very declarative, but I'm often starting with a lot of declarative modeling. Or even just lining them up. Um, you might have Gestalt processor clients who love to line things up. You probably have one or two. So I'll even sing things about like that as they line up the boom whackers across the house or across the room. I think I'm gonna add a B tube. That was one that just worked for a kid like 3 days ago. I think I'm gonna add a B tube. All right, so that's boom markers. Let's talk about pianos. I've worked with so many families who talk about their kids' amazing ability to match the sound they hear on the piano. And if you look at a piano, you can see why it's so compelling. I mean, it's patterns, patterns, patterns. The black and white, the combinations of 8 and 3 and 2. It makes sense that visually they're drawn to it. But then if you've got that veridical mapping of the letters with the notes, it's just like a hyperlexic kid's dream, a GLP's dream, because it's this hierarchy of information. And then horizontally, it gets higher, slightly higher, then lower, lower, lower. There's a lot of logic with a piano. Um, Here are some ideas when it comes to piano. The first thing I always recommend, please, unless it's an antique piano, don't touch that. Unless you're okay with it, label the keys. Please label those keys. They have fancy stickers you can use to label the keys, like C, D, E, etc. In a pinch, I have used tape and a Sharpie. That's actually great if you want to work on fine motor skills or handwriting. I have used a label maker. Just a couple days ago, we got out the label maker and we made a label for each of the buttons. For this kid that I did this with, they're hyperlexic, but they also have hypernumeracy. So we actually did not just the letters, but we did C4 for middle C. We did C5, C6, because there's also numbers that come into play with the different octaves in music. So you can really go as simple or as complex as you want, but please label those buttons. It makes such a difference. I've also done expo markers on there, but those rub off. But that'd be good if it's a kid who's also working on handwriting, because as they play the letters, it'll rub off and then they can write it again. So that's with pianos. Definitely try putting letters on there. With string instruments, I make sure that they have frets because frets provide that visual demarcation of like one note moving into the next. If there aren't frets on something, it's going to be really hard visually for that kid to know to move between notes. It's helpful if they can see it. Frets also are a place where I would say label it. There are really cool stickers that you can order for a ukulele or for a guitar that have the numbers and letters there, and you slide it underneath the strings, and it gives just this rich, like letter-based, number-based set of information that bring that guitar, that ukulele to life for a hyperlexic kid. What's cool though is because of the way a guitar ukulele is arranged, it's not sequential like a piano. They're going to be looking at a new unit that is going to be EADGBE as this new important unit. And so there has to be some, like, they have to do some more thinking about how these letters interact with one another. I think the pathways for learning and language with playing a guitar are really powerful. The thing is, like, you don't have to know how to play these instruments, but if you have them and you're labeling letters and numbers on them, it can just become a connection point for the two of you. You can talk about the strings, you can talk about the songs. You don't have to be able to play these things to connect with the kid about them and build their language. So then media and music. Let's switch from instruments to media. Your hyperlexic GLP is already very likely engaging with video material, right? So let's bring in some modifications and materials that can elevate their language acquisition through symbols, through letters. First action, I always recommend put on those subtitles. Just like, don't even hesitate, put them on. Um, I'm thinking about one of my clients where the subtitles, I mean, have changed the game for her, but also in the brackets, seeing the sound effects, seeing the way they describe the music. They might even describe like background chatter or a sound in the background. So even the things that aren't necessarily the script or the lines can be really valuable, like visual language. Now, there's also a wealth of videos that feature early music learning, music, the ability to read music. I'd say try those out with your client. They bring early music theory to life in a way that a GLP will be drawn to. A lot of them use categorical vocabulary, like colors and fruits or vegetables, and a lot of them use rainbow order. They just know what they're doing. A favorite of mine is called Prodigy's Music Lessons. You can find them on YouTube. This guy knows what he's doing. I mean, it is so perfectly tailored to Gestalt processors. So Prodigy's Music Lessons, look it up. A lot of music, rainbow ordering. He uses fruits and vegetables like beets, cherry, avocado. He finds the rhythmic overlaps with like common words. So finding like, what's the rhythm of that word? And that's something I've done for one of my hyperlexic clients where I was helping them move into learning sheet music was I took their favorite animal names and we figured out what the rhythm was underneath them. Gazelle, hippopotamus, and then wrote out those note values in front of them. And he came to life. He couldn't believe it that, whoa, I can veridically map something new to these animals that I love. Um, so definitely something like Prodigy's music lessons, because they might pick up a lot of new gestalts from videos like that, but then also they're seeing a mapping onto this whole new system of meaning, which is the beginnings of learning how to read music. Now you can also just look up a song that your client loves with sheet music in the search term. So like Circle of Life sheet music, How Far I'll Go sheet music, and see what's out there. There's a lot of free sheet music available where the lyrics are in front of them in this brand new way. You can maybe find that on YouTube. There's also a great website called Muse Score, M-U-S-E, and then Score. I think they have a free trial where you can download a bunch of music on there, and they have some cool creations related to like special interest movies or special interest shows. For those of you who are like, okay, looking like all of that up or finding that, or maybe you're in a setting where you can't use your phone or you can't use media like that, you can really just do like pen and paper. You don't necessarily have to use like a musical staff. If that totally baffles you, just writing out the lyric in front of you from media and then engaging with that in some, in a musical way. So for example, I might write out a line from a movie and then I'll tap along with it on a whiteboard. So let's pick a quote from something like, I am Moana. I'm in a Moana beat right now. And she then goes on the rest of what she's saying. Like, I am Moana. I would write it out and there's rhythm there. Da, 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 da. And then I would tap along on my whiteboard. Ba, 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 ba. So even that is just a simple way of adding a little bit more musicality and intention and rhythm into how you're interacting with the hyperlexic GLP in front of you. You're taking this language that they're hearing from a movie, you're putting it into the visual format and writing it out, and then you're adding a little bit more musicality to it. Da, 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 da. I even do this with just like anything I'm modeling, like, let's go outside. Tap, 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 tap. A little bit more rhythm to bring it to that next level. Now, there is so much more I could say about how to use sheet music, how to bring like note reading into this work. That is going to be for a future episode that is beyond introductory. Um, and it's bringing us to the end of this episode. And so I hope that I've given you some ideas to think about when it comes to how to bring music in with hyperlexic GLPs. I also hope that you're able to see some of the overlapping ideas that really all come back to veridical mapping. If anything, please take that term with you, run with it, go read the papers. They are beautifully written. And I wish you all the best with your Gestalt language processors until I see you again. Looking forward to another episode. I really appreciate you attending. Good night, everyone.